Good morning, everyone. My name is Kaylee Ferraro. I know there are still a few people that are dialing in as we speak, well, as I start to speak. While we're waiting for everyone to get logged in, I'm just going to go over a couple little housekeeping items, and then I'll go ahead and begin the presentation. My name is, again, Kaylee Ferraro. I'm the Manager of Affirmative Action Services here at CAI. Because of the number of people that are attending, everyone is on mute. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, you can type in those questions in the little questions box on the GoToMeeting panel, and those questions will be monitored. And if we're able to answer them during the session, we certainly will. Otherwise, we will follow up with you afterwards via an email or a phone call. We will be sending out a link to the slides and the recording of this webinar in a few days. So hopefully that answers that question. So you should receive a follow-up email from us again within a few days. So it is just right at 10 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the questions box, and we will try to answer them throughout the session. Just a little bit of information about CAI. We are a North Carolina Employers Association and have over 1,200 members. We are a local resource that provides information and assistance with HR and people management questions, as well as learning and development. One of our areas that we focus on is affirmative action, and that is my group. We have been producing affirmative action programs for over 20 years. We are a dedicated resource for you and can provide assistance with all manner of affirmative action compliance, including training and consulting. All right, so what we're going to cover today is just some information about affirmative action. We're going to kind of go over the laws and regulation. Why do we have to do it? Who has to do it? What is required? And then just some miscellaneous and changes that have occurred recently. So what I like to start with for the session is to talk about what is the purpose of affirmative action. It's really intended to promote opportunities for those groups who have historically been disadvantaged. It is based on the principles of equal employment opportunity and is designed to help eliminate discrimination for those protected members, again, who have been historically disadvantaged, and to help remove barriers in the workplace. What it is not, which I think is equally important, it is not designed as a set-aside or quotas. It is not designed to give preferential treatment or to tell companies who they have to hire or who they can't hire or fire. Again, it is just designed to help level the playing field for those groups, again, who have in the past not been treated as equally. So now we get to talk about the exciting part of affirmative action, which is the laws and regulations that require organizations to have to do this. There are 3 regulations that govern affirmative action. I have them listed here, and then I'm going to talk about them individually, and then we'll get into kind of the meat of affirmative action. So the first law is Executive Order 11246. It was signed by President Johnson in 1965. So this has been around a while. It has stayed the course, and I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. But this executive order prohibits federal contractors and subcontractors from discriminating in any employment decisions on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, and national origin. Gender identity and sexual orientation were protected groups that were added in 2015. So they are covered under affirmative action anti-discrimination. And then this executive order also requires federal contractors to engage in affirmative action specifically for women and minorities, because again, those are 2 of the groups that have been historically disadvantaged in the workplace. The second of the 3 laws is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This again prohibits discrimination, this time on the basis of disability status. So federal contractors and subcontractors cannot have any discriminatory practice on the basis of disability status, and it does require them to take affirmative action in employment activities for qualified individuals with disabilities. It also requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for those individuals with disabilities. There were changes to this regulation in 2014. Required some additional record keeping and data analysis that had not previously been required for federal contractors and subcontractors. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as we get further into kind of the meat of this information. And then lastly is the third regulation, which is the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, also known as VEVRA. Again, prohibits discrimination, this time on the basis of protected veteran status, and also requires contractors and subcontractors to take affirmative action to employ and advance veterans in employment decisions. This regulation was also changed in 2014, again, to help improve efforts to recruit and hire individuals that fall under this, this protected status. So let's talk about who has to follow these regulations. It is anyone or any organization that holds a contract directly with a federal government agency. So that is a direct contract, or an organization that is subcontracted to help assist with that original direct contract. So you may not have a direct contract with the federal government, but if you are helping another organization fulfill their contract, you are also covered. So for example, it could be that the direct contract would be with the Department of Defense has a contract to help to have an organization build ships for them. If you are supplying anything that goes into that shipbuilding process, you again are also covered under this. And it doesn't matter how many tiers down you are in that contracting process, you're also covered. So there are some thresholds that make you covered under these requirements or not. The initial basic coverage starts at $10,000 or more for Executive Order 11246, so females and minorities. That's some basic affirmative action coverage, non-discrimination, take some affirmative action requirements. Also, if you're a financial institute and that serves as a federal depository for any federal funds, or you're covered under FDIC or NCUA, you are considered a federal contractor. If you are a construction contractor, there are some different requirements for the women and minorities affirmative action than really what I'm going to focus on today, which is supply and service. You are covered under affirmative action. There are just a little bit different requirements for the women and minorities program. So again, basic coverage starts at $10,000. Once you hit $50,000 in contracts or more, you're subject to having to develop a written affirmative action program. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today, are those companies that have to fulfill that written program. What is it? What do they have to do? All right, so I do have some information, kind of a little chart about who's covered and who's not, because the coverage thresholds are a little bit different. So again, basic coverage for Executive Order 11246 is 10,000 and any number of employees. For individuals with disabilities, that basic coverage amount is $15,000, and then for the veterans requirement, that doesn't kick in until 150,000 or more in contracts. And then again, you'll see for the AAP coverage, the program coverage, that starts at $50,000 or more and 50 or more employees for women and minorities, individuals with disabilities. Again, for veterans, that is 150,000 or more. So it can't be super easy and all be the same, but if you have any questions about this, certainly reach out to CAI. We can assist you with that. So who enforces these regulations and the requirements? There is a division of the Department of Labor known as the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the OFCCP, and they do enforce all three of these regulations and laws. They do select organizations organizations for audit. You can submit a charge of discrimination directly with them, just as you can with the EEOC. And they can ultimately collect financial damages for those companies who have been deemed to be discriminatory. So this is certainly something not to take lightly. If you are covered, I would certainly encourage you to follow the requirements and do your due diligence and try to abide by the regulations, because you don't want to be caught doing something you shouldn't have been doing. So let's talk again a little bit more about what we're going to focus on today, which is the written affirmative action program, and really kind of get into what are the requirements of this program. So a written affirmative action program is required for each one of your locations here in the U.S. that has 50 or more employees. So again, if you meet those thresholds of $50,000 or more and 50 more employees total, if you have multiple locations and any of those locations have more than 50 employees, then you need to have a separate program for that particular location. For locations that you have that have fewer than 50 employees, those employees do have to be part of a program, but you have options. You can create a separate program for them. So if you have an office that has 45 employees, you could certainly create a program for that location, or you can incorporate those employees into one of your other locations. So where the HR function is responsible for that location, you can roll those people there, or who has ultimate reporting responsibility for that location. So they can be rolled into larger locations. And each one of your programs is going to have two separate parts. Really, I'm going to focus on, for women and minorities, there's kind of a narrative portion of the program, and then there are some statistical and numerical reports that you have to prepare. Similarly, with individuals with disabilities and protected veterans, there is some narrative or written portion that you need to incorporate into your program, as well as some numeric thresholds and assessments. So you've determined that you're covered and you're going to go ahead and prepare your affirmative action program. Just note that this is an annual process. So as long as you are covered under those regulations and you hit those thresholds, $50,000 or more and 50 or more employees, every year you have to prepare a written affirmative action program. Now, when you choose to do that is really left to your discretion. So you can choose to be on a calendar year process or a fiscal year process. But just know every year at that time, you're going to need to basically rerun your analysis and redevelop those programs. If you are a new federal contractor, you should have a program in place within 120 days of that contract commencement. So just kind of be aware of that. If you at some point decide that the annual process needs to change for your organization because it makes more sense to be at a different time, you can change your date at a later point. You would just, kind of pick up the renewal process as that occurred. So if you had been doing calendar year and you decide it's better to do it a little bit earlier, or say October, instead of waiting till January to begin your program, you would just pick that up in October. So again, just be aware that there is an annual obligation to do this. And when you're preparing your programs, you're really kind of looking at two different sets of dates. So your affirmative action program is a forward-looking document. This is what we're going to do for this upcoming year. Here are any goals that we're going to establish. Here's what we're going to focus on. And then there is a look back period to take a look back at what happened in the prior year in your employment decisions, specifically looking at hires, promotions, and terminations. So your affirmative action plan in reality is going to kind of cover 2 years, what we're going to do going forward, and then what happened in the prior year from our employment activities. So let's kind of talk about what are the requirements for, I'm going to really kind of talk about these as 3 separate programs. There's a program for women and minorities. What has to be incorporated into these programs, and what kind of analysis has to be conducted. For women and minorities, for the narrative portion, there are some items that you do have to address. You have to have kind of a commitment to equal employment opportunity and affirmative action. So think similar to like your EEO policy. We're not going to discriminate. We're an equal opportunity employer. So you have to show commitment to that equal employment opportunity. Do need to designate who's responsible for the implementation of the program. So you could have kind of an EEO coordinator who's responsible for the day-to-day portions of the program, who's going to write the policies, who's going to make sure everything is updated and documented. And then you're going to have someone who has ultimate responsibility, and that is typically going to be your top US official. So it could be your president and CEO. If your headquarters is outside the US, whoever is responsible for the top person here in the US. You do need to identify if there are any problem areas and then design any action-oriented programs to address those. So if you had goals, what are you going to do to try to meet those? Make sure you're tracking information so that you can report on how you're doing towards meeting those problem areas, as well as some internal auditing and reporting. So are you going to review your personnel activities, your compensation, that sort of thing throughout the year? And then there are the statistical or numeric reports that have to be incorporated. Again, this is done on an annual basis. For the women and minorities, it's going to be based on employee data, and this is a set of data that's from a specific point in time. So think employee snapshot. Who are your employees as of a point in time? What job titles are they in? What department? What's their current compensation? Their hire date. So information about those employees, and these are full-time and part-time employees that are on your payroll. So you're going to use that set of information to prepare some of the required reports that have to be done on an annual basis. So there really are 6 reports that you do need to prepare annually: the workforce analysis, job group analysis, availability, comparing incumbency to availability, placement goals, and prior year goal attainment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these, but just know that they are based on a set of employee data, and then it's taking different looks at how that data is. So looking at it by department versus kind of by affirmative action job groups. I don't have time to get too detailed into these, but if you would like to talk to me about these, I'm happy to answer any questions offline about them. All right, so that is your forward-looking document for your Women and Minorities program. Again, the narrative portion, and then incorporating those statistical and numeric reports. And then I had mentioned that there is kind of that look-back period. So taking a look back at what happened in your employment activities for the year leading up to your program, because until something happens, you can't really determine if there's an issue. So you are required to take a look back at the 12 months leading up to your program at your employment decisions, specifically looking at comparing your hires to who your applicants were, your promotions, your terminations, and then terminations. I also like to take a look at both voluntarily and involuntary terminations. So let's kind of talk about what does this mean? What kind of data are we talking about? Because this is really where companies have a lot of data that they do need to take a look at, and often this is the most challenging information to get and to work with. So when we're talking about these employment activities, I'm going to start with looking at your hires and offers compared to your applicants. What we're doing is we're looking to see if your employment selections are outside of an expected range based on who could have been considered. So we're going to take a look at the selection rates of different groups within these employment activities to see if there are any indications of potential discrimination. So when we're talking about looking at your hires, we're going to look at who you hired over the course of the prior year, and we're going to compare those hires to who your applicants were. So those should have been those applicants who were considered for positions that you hired for. I'm going to back up a little bit. So we're taking a look, and you're going to break this down by affirmative action job groups. So we're going to take a look, for example, at your professional level group, and we're going to see and look at the selection rates of the males that you hired and the selection rates of the females that you hired, and compare those selection rates to who was part of your applicant pool. So in a perfect world, you would like your selection rates to exactly mirror the rates of those groups in your applicant pool. So for example, if you had 100 people who applied for positions, half of which were male and half of which were female, again, in a perfect world, you would have hired half of the new hires would have been male and half of the new hires would have been female. We're looking for when those selection rates are significantly different from that. And again, would just be a potential indicator of discrimination, and then you would certainly once you've run this analysis, make sure that you can defend what your selection rates are, because they're not going to always mirror your applicant pool. There's going to be differences. You just need to make sure that you can defend what those differences are by something other than race and gender. So this seems like it should be pretty easy until we until we start talking about, okay, well, it's pretty easy for us to figure out who we hired. And sure, I have a list of who our applicants were in our applicant tracking system or wherever you house that information. But there are some ways that you can kind of narrow down your pool of applicants, because as many of you know, when you are opening a position these days, you may get lots and lots of applicants. And so the OFCCP in 2006, I believe, created this Internet Applicant Definition to help companies really kind of funnel down those large applicant pools to really reflect who they were considering for positions. So this Internet Applicant Definition kind of has 4 prongs, and it helps you take that big set of applicants that came in and narrow them down into really who has to be incorporated into this type of analysis. So the first prong is that someone has to submit an expression of interest electronically. So that could be they email a resume if that's your process, they come in through your jobs website, however they would apply for a position, and likely the majority of you are getting some type of electronic interest from applicants. So they have to come in through that method, and then you as a contractor have to consider that person for employment for a particular position. So, if you got 500 applications or applicants for a receptionist position, if you only look at 100 of those, because there's no way you can review all 500 resumes or applications that came in, then your applicant pool now is only at 100, because if you didn't review any of those other 400 applicants, then for AAP purposes, we don't have to incorporate them into the analysis. The third prong is that those people that you do review have to meet your basic qualifications of that position. So, maybe not by that receptionist example, but if you're hiring for an engineer and you require an engineering degree and 5 years of experience, then if someone doesn't meet those basic qualifications, then we can kind of remove them from the analysis. And then the last prong is if someone doesn't remove themselves from consideration. So if you try to reach out to someone to bring them on site for an interview and you never get any responses, then we can also take those people out. So, who has to be incorporated into this this analysis can be narrowed down based on this Internet Applicant rule. So things to consider as you're kind of going through your application process is it's really important, especially if you are using an applicant tracking system or you're recruiting electronically, to make sure that you're identifying why people are not moving on in your process. So if you didn't review an application, you need to know that. If you screened someone out because they didn't meet your basic qualifications, you're going to want to know that. So if you're using an applicant tracking system, there's usually something like a disposition code or a disposition reason that you would want to use to identify why people are being kind of selected out of the process. What I find often is that those disposition reasons aren't especially helpful, meaning that we can't really take people out of the analysis because it's not providing enough information. So if the disposition that's provided is just not hired, that doesn't tell me why. Was it because someone didn't meet a basic qualification? Is it because I couldn't get in touch with them? What was the reason that we didn't hire them? So, the more descriptive the disposition information is, the more helpful, because again, it helps you know why someone wasn't moving on in the process, because if they apply for another position and there was a reason you screened them out, that's helpful to know later. But also from your record keeping and your affirmative action analysis, we can start removing people from the analysis if, again, they didn't meet the basic qualifications, they didn't return phone calls, whatever the reason may be. We want to know that, because the larger your applicant pool, the more possibility that there is going to be some flag for potential discrimination. So again, just keep in mind, this is where a lot of organizations really find it difficult to gather the information and to have good information about their applicants, so that this analysis can be conducted properly. So I just kind of have an example of an application log. This is like if you had exported something from an applicant tracking system, or if you're not using an applicant tracking system and you just need to track something. People come in and apply, at your front desk, that's great, but you need to make sure that you're tracking who's coming in, who's applying, what position they're coming in for, who they are, and then you do need to make sure you're soliciting race, gender, veteran, and disability status as they do are considered for positions. So I'll talk about that in a little bit down the line. Another analysis that you do need to conduct is on your promotions. Now, promotions it's a company-defined selection, usually is an action resulting in either higher pay, greater rank, skill, or responsibility. So your organization gets to define what you consider a promotion, and then just know that there are often two different types of promotions. There are those competitive promotions in which position is open and you may consider multiple people, or non-competitive in nature. So someone has been performing really well, you're moving them from an accountant level 1 to a level 2. So you're not providing a promotion to someone else because it's not competitive. You're just kind of moving someone up their career path. And then as far as promotions, who are we going to use as our promotion pool? Well, if you have competitive promotions in which maybe you require people internally to apply for those internal promotions, then that's great. Then your pool are those people who applied, those internal employees that applied. But for those kind of non-competitive, you can use where people promoted from, what group they promoted from, as the pool of who could have potentially promoted for that pool. And then again, you need to take a look at terminations, what happened over the course of the year, who terminated. I do recommend that you track whether or not your terminations were the result of voluntary, so the employee decided to leave, or involuntary, where it was your company's decision for that separation. And then as far as from your pool, this again feels a little uncomfortable often, but your pool would be those people who were employed throughout the year. So we could take a look at are your terminations, more heavily happening to females versus males, based on who was part of your employee record at the time. So, and then again, if you are tracking voluntary and involuntary, you can do an analysis specifically looking at just those involuntary terminations in which it was your company's decision to make that, to see if after you've removed out the people that retired or didn't return to work after leave, or whatever the reason may be that people choose to leave on their own, when it's your company's making the decision, is there more of a pattern one group being selected at a higher rate than other groups. So again, this kind of gives you just an initial indication if there are issues, and allows you to take a look at that information internally, because if you are selected for audit, the OFCCP is going to do these type of analysis themselves. So if you have done them ahead of time and you know the results and you know the reasons why you hired or terminated people, it's going to save you some time down the line because you're already prepared to address those questions that are going to come up. And then just some additional recruiting requirements when we're thinking about, recruiting externally. For women and minorities, there are some requirements that in your job advertisements that you're including an equal opportunity clause. We're an equal opportunity employer. For women, minorities, disabled, veterans, you should be incorporating some type of EEO clause on your job advertisements. If you have affirmative action goals for either women or minorities, you should be doing some type of targeted outreach and recruiting for those areas to, again, try to reach that goal. As you are, recruiting externally, you do need to provide the opportunity for your applicants to voluntarily self-ID their race and gender. You need to make sure that you are tracking all of your applicants, and again, the reason why they are kind of being removed during the process. And then you do need to maintain these records for at least 2 years. I'm going to say 2 years here, but ultimately because of requirements for record keeping for disabled and veterans, which expanded some requirements to 3 years, my suggestion is to maintain all affirmative action related records for at least 3 years. And then finally, lastly, for women and minorities, you are required on an annual basis to take a look at compensation. Now, there are no specific requirements for how you do that. The assistance we get from the OFCCP is you have to evaluate compensation systems to determine if there are gender, race, or ethnicity-based disparities. So that's really all of the help you get on how you want to conduct this type of review. But you should be doing some type of compensation look to make sure that there are no issues when comparing different groups. So when we're looking at females compared to males, are there compensation differences? And if so, can you explain and defend those by something other than someone's race or gender? Again, if there are disparities, then you should investigate that. So how you go about doing that is not defined by the OFCCP. So really you get to decide how you want to do that, as long as you're taking into account race and gender during that process. So you can do something, really complicated and difficult. Think of regression analysis or, different types of statistical analysis and review, or you can just kind of take a look at it. Maybe you're just going to take a look by job title to make sure that the salary differences between males and females is within an expected range. So you can keep it really simple, and you probably should at least start simple, and then if you need to get a little more, well, let's look, statistically, is anything statistically significant, you can certainly do more analysis later. I will say this has been and probably will continue to be a focus during audits. There have been several conciliation agreements that have come out recently for high dollar amounts. Earlier in May, Dell EMC settled with the OFCCP to pay $2.9 million for pay discrimination for females and African Americans. Humana in March had to pay $2.5 million in back pay and interest to women. So it's certainly something that you should be aware. The current administration, as well as the previous administration, is going to continue to focus on this, especially when they are getting these big settlements, and they can, make an impact for that. So certainly not something to take lightly. I certainly encourage you to do some type of compensation review. And if there are issues that you come across, then try to fix them. Okay. So I'm going to switch now to really kind of focus on individuals with disabilities and protected veterans, and what are the requirements of those groups, as they are going to vary a little bit from the women and minorities. One of the ways they differ is there are jurisdictional thresholds. This is reviewed every 5 years, and this is why some of the differences in those thresholds for who's covered and who's not is different than the women and minorities. So again, to be covered under the veterans requirement, your contracts have to be 150,000 or more. That was previously 100,000. And then for veterans, that basic coverage starts at $15,000. Again, that was previously $10,000. But your written affirmative action programs for individuals with disabilities start at, again, 50,000, and then for veterans, 150,000, as well as 50 or more employees. Again, here's that coverage chart. I'm going to kind of go by that pretty quickly. So let's kind of define who's considered a protected veteran and who you have to incorporate into these programs. There are 4 different veteran classifications. There's disabled veterans, so that would be a person who was discharged or released from active duty because of a service-connected disability. Recently separated, that is a veteran who was separated from the U.S. military, from active duty in the U.S. military within a 3-year period. So if someone separated 2 years ago, they're going to fall under this recently separated definition. Active duty, wartime, or campaign badge veterans. So it is someone who served on active duty during which a campaign or expedition badge was awarded. And then armed forces service medal veterans. Again, someone serving in active duty and participated in a military operation in which a armed forces service medal was awarded. So those are the 4 covered veteran classifications in affirmative action. And then as far as who's considered, an individual with a disability, it would be, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major activities, has a record of this impairment, or is regarded as having an impairment. So this does mirror the ADAAA definition, so certainly a lot of people would be considered covered under these definitions. So just keep that in mind as we're talking through disabled. So what are the requirements of the affirmative action program for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans? I'm going to kind of go over these together because they are very similar in nature. So again, this is something that you do have to prepare annually. There are a narrative component as well as some numeric or thresholds that you have to account for as well. Your programs for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans do need to be made available should an employee or an applicant request to see them. Now, you can keep the data elements out of that available document, but the programs themselves, so think the narratives, those do need to be made available should someone request to see them. Your program for women and minorities does not have that same requirement. So what has to be incorporated into the narrative? So similar requirements as the women and minorities, a policy statement about equal opportunity employment, how you're disseminating that policy both internally and externally, who's responsible for the implementation of the program, that you're going to review your personnel processes, and how are you going to train personnel that's involved in this selection decisions, and then reasonable accommodation requirements. Harassment prevention, internal auditing and reporting systems, and then reviewing physical and mental job qualifications. All of that has to be addressed in your programs for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans. So when these two regulations were updated in 2014, some additional requirements were added again to help improve the representation of both veterans and individuals with disabilities into the federal contracting and subcontracting community. You now have to establish utilization goals by affirmative action job groups for individuals with disabilities, and you do have to adopt hiring benchmarks for each of your affirmative action plan locations for protected veterans. You do have to collect certain information on applicants and hires and job openings in which you'll be incorporating into your programs. And then you also have to conduct assessments on any targeted recruitment and outreach efforts that you made for protected veterans and individuals with disabilities. So this is certainly a change for some organizations, is to have to collect data on protected veterans and individuals with disabilities and how you're doing towards meeting those requirements. One of the other changes in those regulation updates was for your job advertisements. I had mentioned for women and minorities, you should have some type of EEO clause in your job advertisements. These regulations did require that you have to note in any job solicitations that you're an equal opportunity employer of individuals with disabilities and protected veterans. Previously, a lot of companies use abbreviations, MFDV, for minorities, females, disabled veterans. You can no longer do that for disabled and veterans. You have to spell that out. So I do have just a sample clause there. One of your other requirements is you do have to invite your applicants to self-identify. So a lot of companies previously did not solicit this information until post-job offer. That has changed. You now need to solicit this information pre-job offer and then again a second time post-job offer. You should be soliciting this information at the same point in time you're soliciting race and gender. So if you have an applicant tracking system and it's part of when someone fills out their profile, their name, their address, you may ask at that point in time them to self-ID race, gender, disability, and protected veterans. So you do have to ask twice, again, both pre-offer and post-offer for both disability and protected veteran status. For your individuals with disability, you also have to survey your employees. You should do so should have done so within the first year of those regulation changes, and then you will have to do so at least every 5 years. You can certainly do so more often, but at least every 5 years you need to resurvey your employee population for their disability status. There is an OMB approved form that you have to use for that. Again, make sure you use that same form for your applicants as you do your employees. For employees, again, you have to do this every 5 years. And then sometime in that 5-year period, you should provide a reminder that this can be updated at any time. So however you typically communicate to your employees, you would do that as well. Again, make sure you are providing an accommodation discussion if someone needs so. Make sure you track that. So if someone asks for an accommodation for a disability, make sure you're logging that and that you know the result of that request. And then I also recommend that you make sure that however you're asking your applicants to apply, so if you have an online jobs board or if you're using an applicant tracking system, make sure that that process is accommodating for those people that have disabilities. So if it's not compatible with assistive devices, software reading programs, whatever the case may be, that you will have some other way that someone can apply if your normal process does not allow someone with disabilities to do so. So let's talk about those utilization goals and the hiring benchmarks. So for individuals with disabilities, for each one of your affirmative action programs, you have to adopt a utilization goal, and that is set at 7%. So each one of your job groups, you would like the representation of your employees to be at least 7% have identified as disabled or not. That we have zero control over that 7% that is provided by the federal government. You also have to adopt hiring benchmarks, and this is set for the location as a whole, affirmative action location as a whole. That rate is currently 6.4%. So that was adjusted in April this year. It was previously 6.7%. But that is what you would like over the course of that affirmative action plan year, is you would like 6.4% of your new hires to be protected veterans. And then again, you have to be doing some type outreach, targeted outreach for veterans and individuals with disabilities, and then you need to be able to conduct a review of whether or not that is working. So I mentioned you also have to collect specific data. You do have to report on, for a 3-year kind of rolling period, the total number of applicants, of those applicants who identified as disabled or veteran, total number of people you hired, and then again, those numbers that you hired that were disabled and veteran, and then the total number of job openings that you had and the jobs that were filled during that year. So again, this is kind of a 3-year rolling period. I have a sample table here, and this is incorporated into your affirmative action program. It can be, again, kind of set aside as an appendix or something, so you can pull this information out, but if you're audited, you will have to supply this information. Again, I mentioned the outreach and recruiting requirements. You need to be able to assess the effectiveness of these efforts. So I have some samples in the slide deck. Again, we'll provide a link to the slides and the recording within a few days. So you have a copy of this, but you need to be able to evaluate, if whatever you're doing is working, because what the government had found when they were auditing companies in the past was they were doing the same thing and the results weren't changing. So if you're doing some type of outreach, you need to show that it's effective, or maybe you don't have enough information yet, but you need to identify what you're doing, when it happened, and then ultimately the evaluation of whether or not you found that effective. And you need to do that both for veterans and individuals with disabilities. I had mentioned the record keeping requirements for most affirmative action records is 2 years. However, for the changes for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans, there are certain components that you have to maintain for 3 years. I think it's easier just to keep everything for 3 years, but if you want to keep some for 2 and some for 3, that's fine. Anything that pertains to outreach for veterans and individuals with disabilities, that data collection and assessments, your self-ID forms, and then anything related to hiring benchmarks for veterans, all of those records have to be maintained for 3 years. If you would like to see sample affirmative action programs, the OFCCP does have some samples on their website. I provided that site here. If you'd like to see, kind of what they addressed and how they address programs, you can certainly do so. So that kind of covers what are the requirements of the programs. So let's talk about, kind of what else is covered under affirmative action, kind of miscellaneous requirements. For federal contractors and subcontractors, you do have to file annual EEO-1 reports. If you're covered under the veterans requirements, you also have to file the VETS 4212. There are some poster requirements. I've talked about that job listing requirement. Well, I've talked about the job listing requirements in the past. I'm going to talk about it again. And then you need to make sure that you're notifying any vendors and subcontractors if they are helping you fulfill your contract. So provide a little more information about each one of these, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Those EEO-1 reports are due annually. That time frame has changed. They're now due March 31 annually, and they are used to collect race, gender, ethnicity, composition of your workforce by location. If you are a private company of 100 or more employees, you are already filing these, but if you fall in that kind of 50 or more employees and you have federal contracts, then you just have to file them a little bit earlier. Again, that filing period was changed to be due in March instead of in September. There was going to be a pay component that you were going to have to provide along with the demographic information that is currently indefinitely postponed. That may change, but as of right now, it will continue to be the demographic information unless something happens in the current administration. The VETS 4212 is due September 30th annually, and this is where you're going to report on information about veteran classifications for protected veterans in your workforce, as well as your new hires for the prior year by EEO1 job categories. Again, this is due September 30th, so start thinking about that. The filing period will open in August, so that's coming up pretty soon. There are some poster requirements, posters that you have to make sure you are incorporating onto your bulletin boards. I'm going to list them here. I'm going to, again, not go over them in a lot of detail, but if you need to talk about any of these, I'm happy to do so offline. I'm going to talk about the job listing requirement. This is something that is covered under the Jobs for Veterans Act. So this is only a requirement if you're covered under the VEVRA. And this requires companies to list any job openings with your state workforce. So your employment service delivery system. So here in North Carolina, that's through the Department of Commerce. They have an online system, NC Works. Anytime you are recruiting externally, you have to list your jobs with your appropriate state job service. This is a requirement. I know a lot of companies don't get great candidates by utilizing this service, but this is not an option. You have to do so. There are 3 exceptions to this requirement. If you're going to recruit internally only, then you don't need to list. If you are recruiting for a senior or executive level management position, you don't have to list that job. And then if that position is going to be very temporary in nature, 3 days or less, then you also don't have to list that job. Otherwise, if you are recruiting externally, you need to make sure you are listing this job, listing all of your jobs. This is one of the things that is really easy to get caught not doing, because if you're audited, the OFCCP is going to reach out to your state service. They're going to ask for, what positions you listed during the audit. They're going to ask you to provide proof that you've done so as well. So certainly take the time, make the effort to do those job listings. I also encourage you to find some other outreach effort for veterans beyond just that job listing requirement. There are a number of services out there. Some of them are free, some of them are for fee, but certainly find something to do some type of targeted outreach. And then again, just a couple things. I'm going to kind of speed through some of these because we're getting close to the end of the time. If your organization is a TRICARE provider, there was an enforcement moratorium that occurred 4 years ago. That was just recently extended for another 2 years. So what that means is if you're a TRICARE provider, the OFCCP has considered you a federal contractor, and many healthcare organizations have disagreed with that. But what this moratorium does is saying they are not going to, basically you're not subject to audit if you're covered only as a TRICARE provider. So just know that enforcement moratorium was extended for another 2 years and will expire in May of 2021. The OFCCP did in fall, as well as in January of this year, host some town halls and communications with federal contractors and HR managers, trying to evaluate where there are issues during the compliance evaluation process. They did come up with kind of 3 action plans for them to focus on, and the three things that they're really going to take a look at are they're going to review and update their compliance assistant materials. So they've had in the past, kind of compliance guidelines. Those are going to be updated and available for federal contractors and subcontractors. So hopefully that helps as well. They're going to assess and improve the quality of training, both provided to their internal officers as well as for the contractor community. And then they have stated that they are going to increase their transparency and communication. If you have gone through the audit process, you may know that a lot of times you just have no idea why they're asking for certain things and what they're going to do with it. So they have identified that they're going to be more transparent about why they're asking for certain information and to help share that information. So we'll see if they're more of a kinder, gentler OFCCP than they have been, but that is what they have noted that they're going to focus on. Earlier this year, they did send out 1,000 corporate scheduling announcement letters. These are what they call courtesy letters that are kind of a heads up that you're on a list for a potential audit throughout the year. Those were sent in February. They did actually start sending the official scheduling letters in March. So if you did receive one of those CSAL letters earlier in February, just be aware that you may actually receive your compliance scheduling letter at some point. When those actual letters go out depends on the workload of the office that you're covered under. So just be on the lookout for those. They typically come out twice a year. So another round may go out sometime this fall. So we'll see. And then just a couple other things. There were minimum wage increase for certain covered contractors. So if you're covered under construction or the Service Contract Act, there's a federal minimum wage of $10.35 that started in January of this year. That's evaluated and updated annually. Paid sick leave for those same federal contractors, again, construction under Davis-Bacon Service Contract Act, that you do have to provide paid sick leave. There was a pay transparency requirement that went in effect in 2016 that just prohibits contractors and subcontractors from retaliating against employees or applicants for discussing pay. So you do have to allow your employees and your applicants to talk about pay if they choose to do so. And then you do need to incorporate a pay transparency policy statement in both your handbook as well as post it where it's available to be seen by employees and applicants. So I did mention that the expansion of sexual orientation and gender identity went into effect in 2015. This is an amendment to Executive Order 11246. So if you have not already done so, just make sure that you update all of your policies, handbooks, any documentation, and ensure that those two groups are covered in your protected classifications. And then finally, there is a supplemental poster to the EEO is the law poster that addresses these regulation changes for federal contractors and subcontractors. So just make sure that you have incorporated that information. I have some other information about functional affirmative action programs. So if you'd like to do those type of programs instead of by physical location, you can certainly do so. There are some requirements for how to do that. Again, I've included the link if that is helpful. And then other than that, luckily, there has not been a big change for federal contractors and subcontractors recently. I know there was there has been talk about the new overtime rule. They've identified that may change. A new proposed rule may come out later this year. So just be aware of that. But the audits are continuing. Federal contractors are going through this process. Just know that, when this happens, it's going to be a time-consuming process. These typically last at least 18 months to 2 years. And just know that some of the big focus has been and probably will continue to be taking a look at compensation and your kind of hiring practices. So think your hires and your applicants information. So we are really close to the end of our time. Just to kind of, I'm going to click over, make sure that you have my contact information. If you do have any questions related to affirmative action or this presentation, certainly reach out to me. If you had questions that we were unable to answer during the session, again, we will follow up with you afterwards. And then we will send out a link with the slides and the recorded presentation if you would like to re-listen to anything. Again, thank you for attending this session. I hope everyone has a great day. And if there's anything that we can do here at CAI, certainly let us know. Thanks again. Bye-bye.